Mark stared at his phone, the screen glowing with a message that shattered everything. "Did you see the video? Helen and her friend seemed pretty close, huh?" His fingers hovered over the play button, heart pounding in his chest. To the thumbnail alone told him enough. Helen, laughing, leaning in too close. The blurred shape of a man beside her. A part of him wanted to ignore it, toss the phone away, and pretend it didn't exist. But he couldn't. As the video played, the sound of cheers filled the air, a familiar voice in the background urging them on. Then it happened. Helen turned, smiled, and let him kiss her. Mark exhaled, slow and controlled, his mind eerily calm. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even hurt anymore. Instead, he typed a comment under the video, his words sharp and final. "After all these years of sneaking around, you finally made it public. Congrats." Mark had always known where he stood in Helen's life, somewhere between convenience and obligation. It wasn't obvious at first, not when they were just starting out, when every moment felt like something out of a dream. She had been warm, affectionate, and attentive, making him believe he was the center of her world. They met during their final year of college, introduced by mutual friends at a party neither of them wanted to attend. Mark wasn't the loud, attention-seeking type, and Helen well. She had been the opposite. She thrived in crowds, drawing people in effortlessly, her laughter contagious, her presence magnetic. But that night, she chose to sit beside him, engaging in a conversation that lasted until the early hours of the morning. From then on, everything fell into place, so Mark thought. Their relationship had its fair share of ups and downs, like any other, but there was always an unspoken tension lingering beneath the surface. Helen had a way of making him feel like he was both important and replaceable at the same time. Some days, she'd be completely invested in him, texting first, planning dates, surprising him with little gifts, just because. Other days, she'd disappear into her own world, leaving Mark to wonder if he had imagined all of it. It wasn't until a year into their relationship that he realized the pattern. Helen's warmth came in waves, and every time she pulled away, it was because someone else had stepped into the picture. The first time it happened, Mark convinced himself it was nothing. A coworker she spoke about too often, a friend from the past who suddenly reappeared. The second time, it stung more late-night calls she dismissed too quickly. Plans that were suddenly canceled because something came up. Each time, Helen had an excuse, a reason that made Mark feel like the one who was overreacting. "You're just imagining things. You know, you're the only one I care about, right?" And every time, he let himself believe her, because love wasn't just about the good moments. It was about patience, about understanding, about trusting someone even when things didn't make sense. That was what Mark told himself, over and over. But deep down, a part of him always knew that Helen had never really let go of her past, that she had always kept one foot outside of their relationship, just in case. And now, the proof was right there in front of him. The video, a moment of betrayal captured for the world to see. This time, there was no explaining it away. Mark scrolled through the comments under the video, his eyes skimming past the words that repeated the same sentiment. They looked perfect together. Finally, everyone knew this would happen sooner or later. They were meant to be. Each comment chipped away at whatever remnants of denial he had left. He locked his phone and exhaled, his expression unreadable. The weight in his chest was familiar, like an old wound reopening. This time, it didn't hurt as much as he thought it would. Helen had been distant the past few weeks, making excuses, avoiding his calls, claiming she was just busy with work. He had tried not to overthink it, knowing that pushing her would only drive her further away. He gave her space, the same way he always did, hoping she'd eventually come back to him like she always had. But this time, she hadn't. Instead, she was here laughing, celebrating, kissing someone else. Mark could almost hear her voice in his head, rehearsing the excuses she would give him. It was just a dare. It didn't mean anything. You're overreacting. Maybe she wouldn't even bother explaining. Maybe she knew he wouldn't believe her anymore. He leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every sign he had ignored. The late replies. The night she claimed she was too tired to talk. The way she seemed lost in thought whenever they were together, as if her mind was somewhere else with someone else. Helen had always been good at keeping secrets, but now she wasn't hiding anymore. The betrayal wasn't in the act itself. It was in the fact that she didn't even care to conceal it. She had let herself be seen, had allowed the moment to be recorded, knowing full well it would reach him. Mark clenched, his jaw, his fingers tightening around the phone. For years, he had convinced himself that his place in her life was unshakable, that no matter how many times she distanced herself, she would always return. But this wasn't something she could take back with a few empty words. Notification popped up on his screen. Helen, we need to talk. Mark stared at the message, unreadable emotions flickering across his face. Finally, after everything, she wanted to talk. But what was left to say? Mark didn't reply. His phone sat beside him, screen still glowing with Helen's message. We need to talk. Talk about what? How she had been lying to his face for months. How she had chosen someone else, but still kept him around as a backup plan. How she had let their entire relationship crumble, only for him to find out through a video that was now making its way through their entire social circle. He had always thought betrayal would feel like a knife to the heart-sharp, unbearable instant. But this felt worse. It was slow, dull, a suffocating weight pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. A part of him wanted to hear her out, to listen to whatever excuses she had lined up. Maybe she would tell him it was a misunderstanding, that things weren't what they seemed. Maybe she'd look at him with those same pleading eyes and ask him to believe in her. And maybe if this had happened months ago, he would have, but not now. Because the truth was, Mark wasn't just feeling hurt. He was tired of being second choice, tired of wondering if he was enough, tired of convincing himself that Helen loved him the way he loved her. He grabbed his phone and stared at her message again. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but no words came. He didn't even know what to say. Should he call her? Should he meet her? Should he give her the chance to explain? He let out a humorless laugh. Explain what? The proof was right in front of him. His friends had already started messaging him, asking if he was okay, if he had seen the video. Some offered sympathy. Others didn't bother hiding their "I told you so" attitude, but none of them knew what was going through his mind right now. Because, strangely, he didn't feel broken. He expected devastation, heartbreak, the kind of pain that would have kept him awake at night. But instead, there was only an eerie calmness settling over him. Like a storm had finally passed. Maybe it was because he had been preparing for this all along. Helen had always had one foot out the door. He'd have spent years trying to pull her back, trying to make her choose him, only to realize she never had any intention of staying. Maybe this was for the best. Mark inhaled deeply, then exhaled. The decision was so clear, it almost made him laugh. He picked up his phone and, without a second thought, typed a response. Mark, there's nothing to talk about. Care. Then, before he could convince himself otherwise, Key blocked her number. Mark thought that blocking Helen would bring him peace, that cutting her off would finally let him move forward. But life had a way of throwing surprises when least expected. 2 days later, as he was leaving work, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He ignored it at first, but the calls kept coming. On the third attempt, he finally answered. Mark. Her voice, soft, hesitant. He almost hung up. Tease, don't. Just hear me out. Mark clenched his jaw, gripping the phone tighter. There's nothing to talk about, Helen. It's not what you think. It's the same tired excuse. It's the same desperate attempt to rewrite what he had already seen with his own eyes. You don't owe me explanations, he said flatly. You made your choice. No, she rushed, her voice cracking. You don't understand. A deep sigh left his lips. I don't care anymore. Silence. For a second, Mark thought she had hung up, but then she spoke again, this time barely above a whisper. I didn't kiss him, Mark. He kissed me. His grip on the phone loosened slightly. I didn't even know the video was being recorded. Never wanted you to see it like that. Mark rubbed his temple, the calm he had felt beginning to waver. It doesn't change anything. His voice was firm, but the certainty he had felt just days ago was cracking. I panicked, she continued. I froze. I should have pushed him away. I know, but I was shocked, and people were cheering, and you let it happen, Mark finished, his tone colder than before. Helen's breath hitched. I told him it was a mistake, Mark. I told him I love you. Mark let out a hollow laugh. Love me, he repeated. Is that why you ignored my calls? Why you disappeared for weeks? Why you always made me feel like I was a temporary option? I was scared, she admitted. I was scared of what? Of losing you, she whispered. Of realizing too late that I don't want to be with anyone else, okay? That I was ruining the one good thing I had. Max squeezed his eyes shut. For years, he had been waiting to hear those words. But now, when she finally said them, they meant nothing. I'm sorry, Helen. His voice was quieter now, steadier, but I'm done. Her breath hitched as if she had never considered that he could actually walk away. I just need one chance to fix this, she pleaded. Please, Mark, just one. He exhaled, glancing up at the night sky. You had years' worth of chances. Then, without another word, he ended the call. This time, he didn't block her. He didn't need to, because for the first time, he knew he wouldn't answer again. Mark thought that was the end of it, that after hanging up on Helen, he'd feel a sense of closure. Then he had finally untangled himself from her web of excuses, half-truths, and temporary affections. But Helen wasn't done. The next evening, she was waiting for him outside his apartment. At first, he thought it was a coincidence that she just happened to be standing there, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale in the glow of the streetlight. But the moment she saw him, the way her shoulders straightened, the determination in her eyes, Mark knew she had come for him. He considered walking past her, pretending not to see. But he had never been one for games, so, with an exhale, he closed the distance between them and said flatly, What do you want, Helen? She flinched, as if his voice alone was enough to hurt her. Can we talk? She asked, her voice quiet. We already did. Not like this. Mark shook his head. It doesn't change anything? You didn't even hear me out. I did. I just didn't like what I heard. Helen swallowed, her eyes darting to the ground. I know I messed up. That's an understatement. I'm not with him, Mark. Her voice cracked. I never was. I never wanted to be. Then why did it take me seeing that video for you to finally say it? His voice was calm, but the weight behind his words was sharp. Helen's lips parted, but no sound came out. Mark huffed a humorless laugh. That's what I thought. He moved to step past her, but she reached out, grabbing his wrist. Please. Her fingers tightened around him, her grip trembling. Mark stilled, his body going rigid at her touch. He didn't pull away, but he didn't hold on either. I don't expect you to forgive me, she whispered, but you need to know the truth, Mark sighed. And what truth is that, Helen? That you froze? That you didn't mean for it to happen? That you were scared? He scoffed, shaking his head. I've heard enough excuses to last me a lifetime. It's not an excuse, she whispered, eyes glistening now. It's the truth. Had spent years reading Helen, her moods, her tells, the subtle shifts in her expressions that betrayed what she didn't say out loud. And right now, for the first time in a long time, he didn't see deception. He saw desperation. Mark, Helen's voice cracked. I swear to you, I wasn't with him. I never wanted to be, but you let him kiss you. Silence. She didn't deny it, because she COULD, single quote. Mark sighed. Not's enough for me. He gently removed her hand from his wrist, stepping back. I hope you find what you're looking for, Helen, but it's not me. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there. Helen had been the one pulling away for years. But now, for the first time, Mark was the one who let go. Mark had expected the weight in his chest to stay, to linger like an old scar, reminding him of everything he had lost. But as the days passed, something strange happened. He felt lighter. At first, it didn't make sense. For years, he had built his life around Helen, adjusting his schedule, waiting for her replies, accepting whatever little affection she gave as if it were enough. He had spent so much time bending himself to fit into her world that he had forgotten what it was like to just exist without her. And yet, here he was, still standing, still breathing, and most importantly, still himself. For the first time in years, he had no unanswered texts weighing on his mind, no calls to wait for, no constant overthinking, no wondering where she was or who she was with. She had always been the one pulling away. Now, for the first time, he was the one who let go. It wasn't immediate. The memory still crept up on him, the way she used to smile at him in the beginning. The inside jokes only they understood, the way she curled up next to him on lazy afternoons. But then he'd remember everything else, too. The unanswered calls, the excuses, the nights she prioritized someone else, the gut-wrenching realization that no matter what he did, he had never been her first choice. And just like that, the memories didn't hurt anymore. He focused on himself, his work, his friends. He started saying yes to things he had once avoided. Nights at bars with coworkers, last-minute road trips with friends, even learning to cook more than just the basics. It turned out, life without Helen wasn't as empty as he thought it would be. Then, one evening weeks after their last conversation, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Helen, I miss you. Mark stared at the text, his thumb hovering over the screen. A few weeks ago, he would have dropped everything for her. Would have answered in seconds, desperate to hear her voice, to convince himself that maybe, just maybe, she had finally chosen him. But now, he just smiled, because for the first time in years, he didn't need her answer anymore. He already knew his own. With a deep breath, Mark deleted the message, and for the first time, he didn't look back. Epilogue. A year passed, and Mark barely thought of Helen anymore. Not because he forced himself to forget, but because life had moved forward. And so had he. He had thrown himself into his work, and it paid off. A promotion, new projects, more responsibility. It was the kind of future he had always put on hold for Helen, waiting, hoping, making space for her. But now, he was choosing himself. His friends noticed the change too. Man, I've never seen you this relaxed before. One of them joked over dinner. Mark laughed. Maybe because I'm not spending all my time overthinking anymore. And it was true. He was no longer the guy who stared at his phone, waiting for a message that might never come. No longer the one rearranging his life for someone who only saw him as an afterthought. One evening, while visiting his parents, his mom casually mentioned something. "Oh, Helen stopped by last week," she said, as she set the dinner table. Mark paused, his hands tightening around his glass. What? His mom nodded. She said she wanted to check on us, brought some groceries, even stayed for tea. Mark frowned. And you let her? What was I supposed to do? Turn her away? His mom shrugged. Besides, she looked different. Different how? His mom hesitated. I don't know. Just ... sad. Quiet, like she wanted to say something, but didn't know how. Mark exhaled. She's probably just feeling guilty. Maybe, his mom said. Or maybe she finally realized what she lost. Mark didn't respond, because maybe she did, but it didn't matter anymore. Final encounter minutes later, Mark was sitting at a cafe, flipping through a book, when he heard a familiar voice. Mark. He glanced up, and there she was, Helen. She looked different, not in a drastic way, but in the little things. Less makeup, a quieter presence. She wasn't wearing the designer brands she used to flaunt, wasn't flashing that effortless confidence she once carried. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then, she gave him a small smile. I didn't think I'd run into you here. I come here a lot. His voice was even, unbothered. Yeah, she nodded, shifting on her feet. I remember. Silence stretched between them. Then, Helen exhaled. Can I sit? Mark hesitated. Once he would have given anything for this moment. To have her look at him like this, like he was someone she still cared about. But now, didn't feel the urge to fix things. Didn't feel the pull to ask why or what if. He simply felt at peace. I should go, he said instead, closing his book. Helen blinked. Mark, he looked at her, offering a small, polite smile. Take care, Helen. Lynn, just like that, he walked away. And for the first time since he had met her, he didn't want to turn back.